They offered the Apache woman with promises of pleasure. The cowboy bet his fate backslash. Few dared to cross this land, but the cowboy and his companions had reasons that outweighed fear. They were moving cautiously, keeping an eye on the horizon for any danger. It was a place where one wrong step could cost a life, and every decision had weight. Yet among the men, a sense of excitement and greed filled the air. They believed they were in control, that the desert would bend to their plans. In their midst was a young Apache woman, her hands bound lightly with rough rope. She walked quietly, careful to keep her face calm though her mind raced. She had grown up learning how to read people, how to survive in moments when others tried to overpower her. These men spoke gently to her, promising safety, comfort, and a future free from fear. Their words sounded like music at first, soft and tempting. But her eyes, trained to notice small details, noticed the sharpness behind their smiles and the coldness behind their eyes. She had been taught that words could hide 1,000 intentions, and she knew not to trust promises alone. The cowboy rode beside her quietly. Unlike the others, he did not laugh or joke about the woman. His eyes followed her carefully, and his heart felt a strange mixture of admiration and unease. He had grown up in these harsh lands, knowing the difference between right and wrong. He understood that strength was not shown in taking advantage of others, but in protecting those who could not protect themselves. Still, he remained silent most of the time, speaking only when he felt it was necessary. The desert made people honest in ways the towns and villages could not. It showed their true intentions under the relentless sun. The woman, though captured and far from her home, refused to show fear. She walked steadily, observing every movement around her. She noticed the way the men shifted their weight when they thought no one was watching, the way their hands lingered on their weapons just a bit too long. She noticed the cowboys' glances, different from the others, soft yet steady, like a light cutting through the darkness. That small sign of difference gave her a spark of hope, but she kept it hidden. Hope was a dangerous thing in these moments, and she could not let herself be carried away by feelings. Survival came first. At night, the group set up a small camp near a cluster of rocks that offered some shelter from the wind. The men gathered around a small fire, laughing and sharing stories. They spoke of towns they planned to reach, of deals they hoped to make, and of treasures they believed were waiting for them at the end of the desert. The woman sat quietly on a nearby rock, her body tired from the day's journey but her mind alert. She listened to every word, storing them like pieces of a puzzle. She learned quickly that they underestimated her. Their laughter was loud, but it did not reach her ears in the same way. She could separate the truth from the noise. The cowboy, sitting across from her by the fire, tossed small pieces of bread toward her quietly. She accepted them with a nod, keeping her eyes down, but she noticed his careful movements. He never joined in their teasing or bragging. He spoke only when necessary, and even then his words were measured and honest. At one point he asked her gently if she was hungry, and when she nodded, he shared more of his food. It was a small gesture, but in the desert, small gestures mattered. It was a silent promise that he would not treat her like the others. As the night deepened, the air grew colder, and the sounds of the desert became more vivid. Coyotes howled in the distance, and the wind whispered through the rocks. The men fell asleep one by one, their bodies sprawled carelessly around the fire. The woman remained awake, her eyes tracing the shadows cast by the flames. She thought of her home, of her family, and of the lessons she had learned about courage and patience. She understood that trust was earned, not given, and though the cowboy seemed different, she kept her guard high. The next morning the sun rose slowly, painting the desert in golden hues. The journey continued and the men's chatter returned. They spoke of the woman in ways that made her skin crawl, using words to tempt and control, speaking of promises they would never keep. Yet she walked on, quiet but strong, listening and watching, understanding that every word was a test, every movement a trap. The cowboy stayed near, sometimes offering water or adjusting her bindings to make them less painful. His actions spoke louder than words, and she noticed. She began to wonder if he would make the choice to stand with her or stay with the men who treated her as less than human. By midday, the desert heat became almost unbearable. The men grew irritable, arguing over supplies and directions. The woman used the opportunity to observe them closely. She noticed weaknesses and tendencies, learning how to predict their next moves. She also noticed the cowboy's patience, how he spoke softly to calm the group or step in when tempers flared. These small acts gave her a sense of safety, a sense that maybe, just maybe, she was not entirely alone in this dangerous place. The journey was exhausting, but it was also a lesson in human nature. The woman understood that the desert revealed more than just physical strength, it revealed character. She had seen many faces of humanity in her short life: cruelty, greed, kindness, and courage. And here, walking through the heat and dust, she realized she was witnessing them all. Some men used promises as weapons, while one cowboy used his honesty as a shield. She understood that choices mattered, and that sometimes, standing quietly while observing could be the greatest act of resistance. As the sun began to sink below the horizon, the group found a small canyon to rest for the night. The woman settled in a shaded area, her body tired but her mind alert. She reflected on the day, on the promises spoken to her, and on the actions of the cowboy who seemed different from the rest. She realized that the desert was not just a place of danger, it was a place of truth. It revealed who could be trusted, who could not, and who would make the choices that mattered when fate hung in the balance. The cowboy, sitting nearby, watched her quietly. He understood the risks he faced, traveling with men who had no sense of honor, but he also understood that he could not ignore the injustice he saw. Something in him recognized the woman's strength, and he felt a quiet determination to protect her as best he could. It was a dangerous decision, one that could cost him dearly, but he knew that living with regret for not acting was a fate worse than facing danger itself. Night fell completely, bringing with it a cool breeze and the stars that seemed impossibly bright in the desert sky. The group was silent, except for the occasional cough or movement of a restless horse. The woman's mind drifted between memories of home and strategies for survival. She realized that this journey would not just test her body, it would test her spirit, her intelligence, and her courage. She would need every ounce of strength she had learned from her people. And she would need to watch the cowboy closely, hoping he would choose the right path, for in this desert, choices could mean life or death. By the first light of dawn, the desert seemed to hold its breath. The group would move again, continuing their long journey, but something had already shifted. The woman was no longer just a passive participant, she was a strategist, a quiet force of observation. And the cowboy, whose actions already showed a glimmer of honor, was about to face choices that would define his fate and hers. The desert, vast and unyielding, had already begun to teach its lessons, and neither of them would be the same when the sun rose higher that day. The sun rose slowly over the desert, painting the sky with soft shades of pink and orange. The cowboy and the group of men stirred from their camp, ready to continue the long journey. The desert seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction, a mix of harsh terrain and beautiful, untamed wilderness. The air was dry and warm, and the wind carried a faint scent of sage and dust. It was a place that tested the patience, strength, and spirit of anyone who dared to cross it. The Apache woman moved quietly among the men. She had learned to hide her thoughts well, to make her presence almost invisible when necessary. Every glance, every movement of the men was carefully observed. She had begun to understand the patterns of their behavior, who grew impatient quickly, who spoke with false authority, and who treated her as more than just an object. Among them, the cowboy was different. His movements were calm, his voice measured, and his eyes seemed to notice things that others missed. As they walked, the men talked loudly, often joking about what they believed would be the woman's reaction to their plans. Their words were meant to entertain themselves, but she listened carefully, storing each detail in her mind. She understood that their promises of comfort, safety, and pleasure were not genuine. They were tools meant to control her, to keep her quiet and obedient. But she would not be easily fooled. She had survived harsh lands and harsher people before, and she knew that patience and careful observation were her strongest allies. The cowboy rode beside her, keeping a quiet watch. Occasionally, he would offer a small word of comfort or hand her some water. She accepted these gestures silently, unsure of how much she could trust him. Yet, unlike the others, he did not speak of her as if she were less than human. He did not make jokes at her expense, and he never joined in the men's teasing. His presence was like a calm in the storm, a steady, silent reminder that not everyone around her had ill intentions. By midday, the sun blazed overhead, making the journey even more exhausting. The men became restless, their tempers flaring in the heat. Arguments broke out over water supplies and the direction they should take. The woman observed everything, noting who shouted first, who remained calm, and who tried to mediate. She realized that understanding human nature was as important as knowing how to survive in the desert. Each argument, each gesture, revealed the character of the men and the potential danger or protection they could offer. During a brief pause, the woman noticed the cowboy helping one of the horses that had stumbled. He moved with careful strength, showing patience and skill. The small act did not go unnoticed. She realized that actions often spoke louder than words. While the other men relied on loud promises and intimidation, the cowboy relied on quiet integrity and practical skill. She began to hope that perhaps he would act when the moment came that required true courage. As the day passed, the group reached a small stream. Water was precious in the desert, and the men wasted no time drinking and filling their canteens. The woman took her turn, moving carefully to avoid drawing attention to herself. She drank slowly, savoring each sip. The cowboy remained close, watching her and the others. When one of the men attempted to approach her with teasing words, he intervened gently but firmly, reminding the man to behave. It was a subtle act, but it did not go unnoticed. The woman felt a small spark of trust growing. Perhaps in this desert filled with danger and deception, there was at least one person who might act rightly. The afternoon brought more challenges. The desert terrain became steeper, the sun hotter, and the wind stronger. The men grew tired, complaining and slowing the pace. The woman kept her thoughts to herself, conserving energy and focus. She watched the cowboy continue to help where he could, moving among the men with quiet authority. He did not demand respect, but he earned it through his actions. Each careful word and helpful gesture set him apart, and she began to wonder what he might do when true danger arrived. As the sun began to lower, casting long shadows across the desert, the group approached a rocky outcrop that offered some shelter. The men set up camp again, their voices loud and brash as they made fire and prepared for the evening. The woman sat quietly nearby, her eyes scanning the landscape. She understood that the desert was unforgiving, but it also gave opportunities for those who were alert and patient. She began to think about strategies, ways to survive, and how to read the intentions of each man around her. The cowboy sat down near her quietly, sharing a small portion of food. They exchanged no words at first, but their eyes met briefly. In that moment, a silent understanding passed between them. Both knew that survival required observation, patience, and careful decisions. The woman had learned to read people, and the cowboy had shown that he could act with integrity, even in a difficult situation. Their silent communication was more powerful than the words of the other men, who were caught up in boasting and empty promises. Night fell over the desert, bringing with it a cool breeze and a sky filled with stars. The men gradually fell asleep, exhausted from the day's journey. The woman remained awake for a time, reflecting on what she had learned. She realized that while she had been captured, she had not lost her strength, intelligence, or ability to act. She had allies where she least expected them, and she had observed weaknesses in those around her that could be used to her advantage. The cowboy, too, remained awake for a while, thinking quietly about the day. He had grown up in a harsh world where survival often required difficult choices. He had seen injustice and cruelty, and he knew that turning a blind eye was sometimes easier than facing the consequences of action. Yet, something in him would not allow him to ignore the situation of the woman. He felt a sense of responsibility, a quiet determination to do what was right, even if it meant risking his own safety. Over the next few days, the journey continued, and the desert tested them all. Heat, fatigue, and hunger became constant companions, and tensions rose among the men. Arguments flared, supplies ran low, and the harsh reality of the desert made every decision critical. The woman observed everything, learning more about the personalities, strengths, and weaknesses of those around her. The cowboy continued to act with quiet integrity, helping when necessary and intervening subtly to prevent harm. With each passing day, the woman grew more confident in her understanding of the men and the desert. She realized that survival was not just about strength or speed, it was about intelligence, observation, and courage. She also began to trust, cautiously, the cowboy who had shown himself to be different. He did not make promises or empty threats, he acted with honesty and care. That small difference could become the key to her survival in the days to come. As they camped one evening, the woman reflected on the journey so far. She had been offered false promises and empty gestures, yet she had also seen acts of kindness and integrity. She realized that every decision she made, every observation she noted would matter. The desert was not just a physical challenge. It was a test of character, judgment, and courage. And the cowboy, standing quietly near her, would soon play a role in shaping the choices that could determine both of their fates. By the time the night was fully upon them, the desert had grown silent except for the occasional sound of wind or distant wildlife. The woman lay under the stars, her mind alert and her senses sharp. She knew that the days ahead would be filled with challenges, but she felt a quiet strength growing inside her. She had survived harsh lands and difficult people before, and she would survive this journey as well. And somewhere in the darkness, the cowboy watched silently, ready to act when the moment came that required true courage and honor. The desert was quiet that morning, almost eerily so. The sun was rising over distant hills, casting a soft golden light across the sand and rocks. The group had traveled far and exhaustion was starting to show on their faces. The men moved more slowly, their conversations shorter, their tempers fraying. The Apache woman noticed everything, just as she always had. She observed the way they handled their weapons, the way their voices betrayed frustration, and the small gestures that revealed their true thoughts. Every detail mattered. Every small movement could tell her whether a man was honest, weak, or dangerous. The cowboy rode beside her, calm and steady. Unlike the others, he did not grumble about the heat or complain about the journey. He remained alert, watching the horizon and the group alike. There was a quiet wisdom in his actions, a sense that he was thinking several steps ahead. The woman began to trust him slightly more each day, though she remained cautious. She had learned the hard way that appearances could be deceiving, and trust had to be earned, not given freely. As they moved across a particularly rocky area, the group encountered a small canyon. The path was narrow, and the men had to carefully maneuver their horses and supplies. The Apache woman saw immediately that this was a risky place. A wrong step could lead to injury or worse. The men, in their usual overconfidence, ignored the warning signs. They joked and pushed forward carelessly. The cowboy, however, slowed his horse and guided the others with quiet instructions, helping them avoid danger. The woman watched him carefully, realizing that his sense of responsibility was not just for her sake, but for everyone's safety. During a rest near a shaded rock formation, the men began to speak in hushed tones, though still loud enough for the woman to hear. They were making plans, discussing what they intended to do when they reached their destination. Their words were careless and revealing. They spoke of promises they had made to her, promises that were clearly false. They believed they could control her with words, with flattery, with false hope. But the woman had learned to read between the lines. She understood that their intentions were selfish, meant only to satisfy their own desires. The cowboy noticed her attention and followed her gaze. He understood immediately what she had realized. He also knew that the desert was unforgiving, and that actions taken now could have consequences later. He quietly stepped closer to the woman, whispering a few words of advice. He told her to remain calm, to be patient, and to observe. Every word was measured and careful, intended to guide without drawing unnecessary attention from the others. The woman nodded slightly, appreciating the subtle guidance. It was a small act, but in the desert, small acts often made the biggest difference. As the day continued, the heat became nearly unbearable. The men's patience grew shorter, and arguments flared over water, food, and the direction they should take. The woman observed carefully, noting who was quick to anger and who attempted to maintain control. She realized that understanding the personalities of the men around her was just as important as navigating the desert itself. The cowboy intervened subtly at times, calming tempers and redirecting conflicts before they became serious. His quiet leadership stood in contrast to the brashness of the others. By afternoon, the group reached a small oasis, a rare gift in the desert. Water flowed gently from a spring, and patches of green offered shade from the relentless sun. The men rushed forward, eager to drink and fill their supplies. The woman approached more cautiously, aware that in moments of comfort, danger could appear just as easily. She drank slowly, savoring each sip while keeping her eyes alert. The cowboy stayed close, offering her a hand or moving a rock to give her more space. His actions were protective, not possessive, and she began to feel a sense of safety she had not felt since being captured. As they rested, one of the men approached the woman with a smile and a comment meant to unsettle her. The cowboy immediately stepped between them, his voice firm but calm. He reminded the man to treat her with respect, making it clear that her dignity would not be ignored. The woman watched silently, a small spark of hope igniting in her heart. Here was a man who understood right from wrong, who was willing to act even when it was risky. She realized that perhaps she was not entirely alone in this harsh desert after all. The days that followed were difficult. The desert tested them constantly with its heat, rocky terrain, and unpredictable winds. The men grew more impatient, and the woman's attention to detail became more critical. She noticed subtle shifts in behavior: who hoarded water, who whispered plans behind closed gestures, who watched others with distrust. Each observation helped her plan her next steps. She knew that survival required more than strength. It required intelligence, patience, and courage. The cowboy continued to act with quiet integrity. He helped when necessary, stepped in to prevent harm, and offered words of caution to both the woman and the other men. He did not boast or seek recognition. His sense of honor was clear in his actions alone. The woman noticed the way he treated others, even those who were unkind or unfair. She realized that he had a moral compass that would not bend easily. This recognition gave her a small measure of trust, though she kept it hidden carefully. Trust in the desert could be a powerful tool, but it could also be dangerous if misplaced. One evening, as the sun set and the sky turned deep shades of orange and purple, the woman found a quiet moment to think. She reflected on her journey so far, on the men around her, and on the cowboy who seemed different from the rest. She realized that the promises made to her were hollow, but that the desert had revealed the true character of those she traveled with. Strength was not measured by words or threats. It was measured by action, patience, and courage. And in the cowboy, she saw the potential for an ally, someone who might stand with her when the time came to face real danger. That night, as they set up camp in a small canyon, the woman remained alert while the others rested. The desert was quiet except for the occasional whisper of wind and the distant call of an owl. The cowboy, noticing her vigilance, sat quietly nearby. They did not speak much, but their eyes met in understanding. Both knew that the journey ahead would demand courage and intelligence, that choices made now could determine life or death. The silent communication between them was powerful. No words were needed to share the understanding of the challenges that awaited. Over the next few days, the desert grew harsher. The sun burned hotter, the wind blew stronger, and the terrain became more treacherous. The men grew more restless, and conflicts became more frequent. The woman continued to observe, noting every detail, while the cowboy continued to act with quiet integrity. He guided the group carefully, intervened when necessary, and ensured that the woman was not harmed. His actions demonstrated that he valued justice and fairness above convenience or greed. The woman realized that survival depended on more than physical strength. It required understanding people, predicting their actions, and making careful decisions. She had grown stronger in her observation skills and more confident in her ability to navigate the dangers around her. The cowboy's quiet guidance and integrity gave her hope that together, they might be able to face whatever challenges lay ahead. One afternoon, the group encountered a particularly difficult stretch of rocky terrain. The men began to argue loudly about the best path to take, each insisting that his idea was correct. The woman stayed silent, observing the conflict and noting the weaknesses of each man. The cowboy, however, remained calm. He assessed the terrain carefully, then spoke quietly and confidently, guiding the group safely through the rocks. The men grumbled but followed his lead. The woman watched, impressed by his calm authority and careful judgment. As night fell, the desert grew cold and the stars shone brightly above. The group settled around a small fire, exhausted from the day's challenges. The woman sat quietly near the cowboy, reflecting on what she had learned. She understood that the journey ahead would test both her and the cowboy in ways they could not yet imagine. But she also realized that they had a shared understanding, a silent bond forged in observation, trust, and careful action. In the harsh desert, that bond might be the key to survival. By the time the moon rose high in the sky, casting silver light across the desert, the woman felt a quiet determination growing inside her. She had faced danger before and survived. She had observed, learned, and prepared for what was to come. And she had recognized a rare quality in the cowboy, a sense of honor and courage that could make the difference when true challenges arose. Together, they were ready to face the next stage of their journey, whatever it might bring. The desert seemed even harsher that morning, as if it sensed the tension in the group. The sun rose slowly, burning off the cool of night, and the rocks and sand reflected the heat in a glaring shimmer. The men had grown restless during the journey, their tempers short and their words sharp. Every small disagreement seemed ready to erupt into a larger conflict. The Apache woman moved carefully among them, observing each gesture, each word, each flicker of emotion in their eyes. She knew that danger did not always come from the land. It often came from the people around her. The cowboy remained beside her, calm and watchful. He had grown even more cautious over the past days, sensing that the men's patience was fading and that small conflicts could quickly become dangerous. He did not speak loudly or demand attention, but he remained present, guiding quietly, helping subtly, and keeping the woman safe when possible. His actions were deliberate, measured, and protective, and the woman could see that he was beginning to stand apart from the others in a way that was both reassuring and powerful. By midday, the group reached a narrow passage between two rocky cliffs. The path was uneven, filled with loose stones and steep edges. The men began arguing about the best route, each insisting that his idea was correct. The woman stayed silent, studying them carefully. She noticed how quickly tempers flared, how easily the men became frustrated, and how little thought they gave to the danger ahead. In contrast, the cowboy assessed the terrain quietly, pointing out safe footholds and guiding the group through the rocks with calm authority. The difference in their approach was clear. The cowboy relied on careful judgment and skill, while the others relied on force and stubbornness. As the afternoon wore on, the heat grew almost unbearable. Sweat ran down the faces of the men, their fatigue making them more impatient and careless. The woman's careful observations became even more crucial. She noticed how some men hoarded water or moved recklessly, creating unnecessary danger. She realized that the desert did not forgive mistakes, and that one misstep could have serious consequences. The cowboy continued to guide the group, quietly correcting dangerous actions and helping maintain a sense of order, even when tempers flared. The tension reached a peak when one of the men, frustrated by the rocky terrain, shouted at the woman. His words were meant to intimidate and control, to remind her that she was at their mercy. The woman stood her ground, her gaze steady, refusing to show fear. She understood that reacting with anger or panic would only give him power. The cowboy, noticing the confrontation, intervened gently but firmly. He reminded the man to behave, speaking with authority that left no room for argument. The man stepped back, muttering under his breath, while the woman felt a small but meaningful sense of relief. Here was someone who would act when others refused. The night brought a momentary calm. The group settled in a small canyon, using rocks for shelter against the wind. The woman sat quietly near the cowboy, reflecting on the day's events. She realized that the desert was not just testing their physical strength, it was testing their character, their choices, and their courage. She had observed cruelty, impatience, and selfishness, but she had also seen acts of integrity, patience, and quiet bravery. And the cowboy, standing calmly and acting with care, was a reminder that not all people followed the easy path of self-interest. Over the next few days, the journey grew even more challenging. Heat, thirst, and rocky terrain tested everyone's limits. The men's arguments became more frequent and more bitter, and the woman continued to watch and learn. She noticed patterns in their behavior: who would lash out first, who would follow the crowd, and who would act with reason. She realized that understanding these patterns could give her a strategic advantage, helping her navigate both the physical and human dangers around her. The cowboy remained consistent throughout. He offered help without seeking praise, guided with skill and patience, and acted as a subtle shield for the woman when needed. She began to rely on his presence, though she never let herself fully trust anyone yet. Trust, she knew, could be a dangerous thing in the desert if placed incorrectly, but she felt a growing sense of hope, a small assurance that not everyone around her was cruel or selfish. One afternoon, the group encountered a steep slope leading down into a dry riverbed. The men argued loudly about how to descend safely, some suggesting risky shortcuts while others shouted instructions that made no sense. The woman stayed at the edge, her eyes scanning for safe paths and potential dangers. The cowboy, seeing the risk, carefully guided the group, demonstrating safe footing and ensuring that the woman and others followed the correct path. His calm authority contrasted sharply with the chaos around him, and the woman recognized that he had a rare combination of skill, patience, and courage. As they reached the bottom of the slope, a sudden commotion erupted. One of the men, careless and impatient, nearly lost control of his horse. The animal slipped on loose stones, causing panic among the others. The woman instinctively moved out of harm's way, and the cowboy acted quickly to stabilize the situation. He guided the men, calmed the horses, and prevented what could have been a serious accident. The incident highlighted the dangers of the desert and the importance of steady, careful action. The woman realized that the cowboy's presence was more than comforting. It was essential to their survival. Night fell, and the group set up camp near a cluster of rocks that offered some shelter. The men were exhausted, their voices quieter, and their tempers subdued for the first time in days. The woman sat silently, reflecting on the recent events and the choices she had witnessed. She understood that courage was not always loud or dramatic. Sometimes it was quiet, consistent, and deliberate. The cowboy embodied this kind of courage, acting when necessary and guiding others without seeking recognition. During the night, the woman considered her own next steps. She knew that the journey was far from over and that challenges would only grow more severe. She also understood that her survival depended on careful observation, patience, and strategic thinking. The desert had taught her that physical strength alone was not enough. Intelligence, awareness, and the ability to act decisively in critical moments were just as important, and she realized that the cowboy might be the key to navigating these dangers. In the early hours before dawn, a tense moment arrived. One of the men, growing increasingly frustrated and reckless, began to threaten the woman. His words were sharp and meant to intimidate, to assert control. The woman remained calm, keeping her gaze steady and refusing to react. The cowboy, seeing the situation, stepped forward. His voice was quiet but firm, carrying an authority that demanded attention. He reminded the man that his behavior was unacceptable and that the woman would not be harmed. The man backed down, surprised by the quiet courage and strength in the cowboy's actions. By the time the sun rose, casting light across the desert, the group had learned a small but important lesson. True strength was not measured by threats or loud words, but by actions that protected and guided others. The woman observed this lesson carefully, understanding that her ability to survive depended not only on her own skills, but also on recognizing allies and understanding who could act with integrity. The cowboy had shown her that integrity and courage could exist even in the harshest circumstances, and that such qualities could make a life-saving difference. As the journey continued, the desert grew even more challenging, with rough terrain, high winds, and limited water. The men's tempers continued to test the limits of patience, but the woman had grown skilled at reading their behavior. She noticed when someone was about to act rashly, and she learned to anticipate the actions of those around her. The cowboy continued to act as a stabilizing presence, quietly guiding, helping, and protecting when necessary. His steady courage provided a silent sense of security, even in the face of growing danger. By the fourth day, the woman realized that the time was approaching when critical choices would have to be made. She had learned enough about the men around her to understand who could be trusted and who could not. She had observed the cowboy carefully, noting his patience, skill, and quiet integrity. She knew that he might be the only person willing to act when danger became unavoidable, and in the desert, danger was never far away. As night fell again, the group settled in a small canyon, exhausted from the day's trials. The woman and the cowboy sat apart from the others, quietly reflecting on the journey so far. They shared no words, but a silent understanding passed between them. Both knew that the desert demanded courage, intelligence, and careful action. Both knew that the days ahead would require difficult decisions, and that the choices they made could determine their fates. And both knew that standing together might be the key to surviving what was coming. The desert was quiet that morning, but the stillness carried a heavy weight. The sun had risen slowly, casting long shadows across the sand and rocks, and the heat already pressed down on the travelers. The men had grown more restless with each passing day, their patience thinned by the unending journey and the harsh conditions. Arguments and whispered frustrations were constant companions, and the air seemed thick with tension. The Apache woman walked steadily among them, her senses sharp and her mind alert. She knew that the moment of real danger was approaching, and she had to be ready. The cowboy rode beside her, calm and collected as ever. He had grown increasingly aware of the risks, not just from the land, but from the men who surrounded them. He understood that his decisions now could affect not only his life, but the life of the woman he had quietly vowed to protect. His eyes scanned every movement, every expression, every hint of aggression or weakness in the men around them. He knew that subtle actions could change the course of events, that small interventions could prevent disaster. By midday, the group reached a narrow passage lined with jagged rocks and loose gravel. The men began to argue about the best way to proceed, each insisting his path was correct. The woman stayed silent, studying the situation. She noticed which men were reckless and which were cautious, who acted with anger and who acted with reason. The cowboy, as always, assessed the terrain quietly. He guided the group carefully, choosing the safest path and instructing the others without raising his voice. The contrast between his calm control and the men's chaotic bickering was stark. Suddenly, one of the men, frustrated by the slow pace, made a reckless move. He kicked a rock that slipped, causing a small landslide down the path. The horses panicked, and the group teetered on the edge of chaos. The woman instinctively stepped back to avoid danger, her heart racing. The cowboy acted immediately, using his experience and strength to steady the men and calm the horses. His quick thinking prevented what could have been a serious accident. The woman watched silently, impressed by his courage and skill. She realized that his steady presence could make the difference between life and death in this unforgiving desert. The incident had a quiet effect on the group. The men grew more cautious, their earlier arrogance replaced with a cautious respect for the cowboy's judgment. The woman, too, felt a growing confidence. She had observed, learned, and understood the strengths and weaknesses of everyone around her. She knew that the choices made in the coming hours could be decisive. Survival required more than strength or skill. It required intelligence, patience, and careful observation. And she realized that the cowboy shared these qualities, making him a true ally. As the afternoon heat pressed down, the group reached a wide, open plateau. The sun blazed overhead and the sand shimmered in waves. The men, fatigued and irritated, began to argue again, their voices carrying across the empty landscape. The woman remained quiet, noting who was aggressive, who was hesitant, and who seemed willing to follow reason. The cowboy moved calmly among them, guiding them with quiet authority and preventing any reckless actions. He also watched the woman carefully, making sure she remained safe without drawing attention to her. It was clear that the desert was testing more than their physical endurance. It was testing their character. The woman reflected on the journey so far, the false promises, the harsh conditions, and the moments of courage she had witnessed. She understood that survival required courage and intelligence in equal measure. She also recognized that the cowboy's actions had shown a rare integrity, a willingness to stand for what was right even when it was risky. This realization gave her a small but meaningful hope that together they could face whatever challenges lay ahead. As the sun began to lower, the group approached a steep canyon that they needed to cross. The rocks were jagged, the path narrow, and the drop on one side steep. The men began to argue loudly about how to proceed, their voices echoing off the canyon walls. One of the more reckless men attempted to take a dangerous shortcut, ignoring the warnings of others. The woman's heart raced. She knew that a single mistake here could be fatal. The cowboy stepped forward quietly but decisively. He positioned himself to guide the group, giving clear and calm instructions. His authority was recognized silently, and the reckless man reluctantly followed his lead. The descent into the canyon was tense. Every step had to be calculated, every movement precise. The horses navigated carefully, and the men followed instructions with growing respect. The woman observed closely, noticing which men were beginning to show humility and which still relied on arrogance and force. The cowboy continued to act as a steady guide, helping those who struggled and ensuring that no one made a fatal mistake. His quiet courage and skill made him the true leader, even if he did not seek that position. Night fell as the group finally reached the bottom of the canyon. The stars shone brightly, and a cool breeze replaced the harsh heat of the day. The men were exhausted, their arguments quieter, their movements slower. The woman found a place to rest near the cowboy, feeling a small sense of relief. The journey had been long and dangerous, but she had survived by observing, learning, and making careful choices. She realized that the cowboy had not only protected her, but had also shown that integrity and courage could exist even in the harshest circumstances. The following days continued with similar challenges. The desert offered no comfort, only harsh sun, rough terrain, and limited water. The men grew more anxious, and tensions rose. The woman continued to observe, learning who could be trusted and who could not. The cowboy remained by her side, guiding, protecting, and acting with quiet wisdom. His presence provided a sense of security, a reminder that careful and courageous action could prevent disaster. Eventually, the group reached a narrow valley where a small stream offered water and shade. The men were eager to rest, and some began to relax in the brief respite. The woman drank slowly, remaining alert. She noticed a change in the group dynamics. The reckless and aggressive men had begun to recognize the cowboy's authority, following his guidance even without his speaking much. The woman realized that his courage and integrity had not only protected her, but had also influenced the group's behavior. That night, as the fire crackled and the desert grew quiet, the woman and the cowboy sat near each other, reflecting on the journey. They exchanged no words, but there was a shared understanding. Both knew that the desert had tested their endurance, courage, and intelligence. Both knew that the coming challenges could be even greater, but they also understood that by working together, they had a chance to face whatever lay ahead. The silent bond between them had grown stronger through observation, shared experience, and mutual respect. The next morning brought a final test. The group approached a narrow ridge that overlooked a deep canyon. The path was treacherous, and the men's tempers flared as they argued about the safest way forward. One of the reckless men attempted to force his way across, ignoring warnings. The woman's heart pounded. The cowboy stepped forward decisively, placing himself between the man and the dangerous path. His calm but firm instructions stopped the reckless action. The men, recognizing the authority in his voice and the skill in his actions, followed his guidance. The woman watched, understanding that his courage had once again prevented disaster. As the day wore on, the group finally reached a safer path through the desert. The journey had been long and challenging, but they had survived. The woman reflected on what she had learned. Patience, observation, courage, and intelligence were as important as physical strength. She recognized that the cowboy's guidance had been crucial, and she felt a deep respect for his integrity and courage. By the evening, they had reached a place where the desert began to open into more fertile land. The men were tired but relieved. The woman felt a sense of accomplishment and quiet triumph. She had survived the journey, observed the true nature of those around her, and found an ally in the cowboy. She realized that the desert had taught her many lessons, not just about survival, but about human nature, courage, and the power of integrity. The cowboy, too, reflected on the journey. He had acted with quiet courage and integrity, making difficult choices to protect those who could not protect themselves. He had stood against recklessness and cruelty, and in doing so, had shaped the outcome of the journey. Though the desert had tested him in ways he could not have predicted, he had emerged with his principles intact. As the group settled for the night, the woman and the cowboy shared a final, quiet moment of understanding. The desert had been harsh, the men difficult, and the journey exhausting. But through careful observation, courage, and integrity, they had survived. They had learned the value of trust, the importance of patience, and the power of quiet courage. And in that moment, beneath the vast desert sky, they knew that their lives had been changed forever by the choices they had made. The desert, silent and endless, had witnessed their journey, their courage, and their growth. And as the stars shone brightly above, the woman and the cowboy rested, knowing that they had faced danger together and emerged stronger, wiser, and forever connected by the lessons of the harsh and beautiful land.